Morgan Blackwood squinted at the darkening Montana sky, his weathered face creasing with concern. 30 years of ranching had taught him to read the clouds like others read books, and today's forecast was grim. The December air carried a metallic chill that meant only one thing. A blue norther was coming, and it was coming fast. "Damn it all," he muttered, pulling his sheepskin collar higher against the wind. The cattle needed to be moved to the sheltered pasture, and quickly. Morgan whistled for his border collie, Rusty, who bounded over with practiced enthusiasm. "Let's get him, boy." As they worked to herd the cattle toward safety, Morgan's thoughts drifted to the phone call he'd received that morning. His sister Clara's voice had been thin with desperation. "It's about Jamie," she'd said. "The foster placement fell through." Again, Morgan's 12-year-old nephew had been bouncing around the system since Clara's daughter died 3 years ago. Clara, battling late-stage cancer and living in a one-room apartment in Billings, couldn't take him. And with each failed placement, the whispers grew louder. The boy was troubled, difficult. Some even called him cursed. The devil's child, they'd whisper in church. Everywhere he goes, misfortune follows. Morgan had never met the boy. He'd been estranged from his sister for years before her daughter's death. Family complications, stubborn pride, the usual poison that separates blood from blood. "They're sending him to a group home in Great Falls," Clara had explained. Unless what? Morgan had asked, already knowing the answer. "Unless you'll take him." The question hung in the air like the storm clouds now gathering above his 800-acre ranch. Morgan had no business raising a child. He lived alone by choice. His only company the seasonal ranch hands, who helped during calving, and Rusty, who asked for nothing but food and the occasional pat on the head. A crack of thunder startled one of the heifers, sending her bolting toward the fence line. Morgan cursed and spurred his horse, cutting her off before she could injure herself. "Easy, girl," he soothed, guiding her back to the herd. Easy now. By the time the cattle were secured, the temperature had dropped 15 degrees. Morgan's breath clouded in front of him as he dismounted at the barn, his knees complaining at the impact. Inside the ranch house, Morgan poured himself 2 fingers of whiskey and stared at the phone. The social worker had said they needed an answer by 5. It was 4:30 now. The first flakes of snow began to fall as Morgan dialed the number, each one as hesitant as his heart. "This is Morgan Blackwood," he said when the social worker answered. "I'll take the boy." 3 hours later, headlights cut through the thickening snow as a county vehicle crawled up his driveway. Morgan stood on the porch, watching as a thin figure emerged from the passenger side, a small duffel bag clutched in one hand. The social worker hustled the boy toward the house, leaning into the wind. "Mr. Blackwood, this is Jamie. Jamie, your Uncle Morgan." The boy looked up, his face half hidden by a too large hood. His eyes were dark and wary, like those of a cornered animal. Morgan recognized that look. He'd seen it in wild horses before they decided whether to bolt or attack. "Storm's getting worse," the social worker said, glancing nervously at the sky. "I need to get back to town before the roads close." After a hurried signature on some paperwork, she was gone, leaving uncle and nephew alone with the howling wind. "You hungry?" Morgan asked. Jamie shrugged, not meeting his eyes. "Well, I am," Morgan said, turning toward the kitchen. "Come on in. House ain't much, but it's warm." As they stepped inside, the wind slammed the door behind them with such force that a framed photograph fell from the wall, the glass shattering across the wooden floor. Jamie flinched, his eyes widening. "Just the wind," Morgan said, though something cold that had nothing to do with the temperature crept up his spine. Outside, the snow began to fall in earnest, blanketing the world in white silence. And somewhere in the north pasture, the first of the cattle began to freeze. Clearwater, Montana, population 2,412, was the kind of town where everyone knew your business before you did. So when Morgan Blackwood drove into town the morning after the storm with a sullen boy in the passenger seat of his pickup, the whispers started before they'd even parked outside Jensen's General Store. The mercury had barely crawled above zero, and the aftermath of the storm was evident everywhere. Power lines drooped under the weight of ice, and the streets were lined with snowdrifts taller than a man. But it was the news from the outlying ranches that had everyone talking. Lost 17 head last night. Earl Peterson told Morgan as they stood by the coffee machine in Jensen's. Found him this morning, frozen solid where they stood. Never seen anything like it. Morgan nodded grimly. 8 here. North pasture. Would have been worse if we hadn't moved most of the herd beforehand. Earl's eyes drifted to Jamie, who was standing awkwardly by the magazine rack, pretending to read a farming journal. That Clara's grandson? He asked, lowering his voice. My nephew, Morgan confirmed, his tone making it clear he didn't welcome further questions. But Earl wasn't done. Heard he's been through 5 foster homes in 3 years. Trouble follows that boy like flies on manure. Morgan felt a surge of protectiveness he hadn't expected. He's a kid who's had a rough go. Nothing more. Earl raised his hands in mock surrender. Just saying what everyone's thinking, Morgan. Same night you taken that boy, we get the worst storm in 30 years. Cattle freezing where they stand? That ain't natural. Morgan paid for his supplies and coffee, signaling to Jamie that it was time to go. As they loaded the groceries into the truck, Morgan noticed Mrs. Wilson, the town librarian, staring from across the street. When she caught his eye, she quickly made the sign of the cross before hurrying away. They don't like me, Jamie said flatly as they drove out of town. It wasn't a question. Morgan adjusted his grip on the steering wheel. They don't know you. Doesn't matter. It's always the same. Jamie turned to look out the window at the passing landscape, white and pristine under the morning sun. Are you going to send me back too? The question hung in the air between them. Morgan thought carefully before answering. Look, I don't know the first thing about raising kids. I'm set in my ways, and I live in the middle of nowhere. But your family, and in my book, that counts for something. Jamie didn't respond, but Morgan noticed his shoulders relax slightly. Back at the ranch, they found Hank Tully, Morgan's most reliable ranch hand, examining the frozen cattle in the north pasture. Never seen anything like it, boss, Hank said, shaking his head. It's like they just stopped. No sign of struggle. No attempt to find shelter. Just froze where they stood. Morgan knelt beside one of the animals, a young heifer he'd been particularly fond of. Her eyes were open, glazed over with frost, her body rigid in mid-stride. What do you think happened? Morgan asked. Hank glanced at Jamie, who was standing a few yards away, kicking at the snow. Temperature dropped too fast for them to react, maybe. Or, he trailed off. Or what? Hank lowered his voice. Town's talking. About the boy. About the timing. Morgan straightened up, fixing Hank with a hard stare. You've been working for me, what, 15 years now? Going on 16, Hank confirmed. In all that time, have you ever known me to put stock in superstitious nonsense? Hank had the decency to look embarrassed. No, sir. Good, because I'm not about to start now. We lost some cattle to a bad storm. It happens. Now let's salvage what meat we can and move on. As they worked, Morgan kept an eye on Jamie, who had wandered to the edge of the pasture. The boy stood alone, a small figure against the vast white landscape, watching them with those dark, careful eyes. Later that evening, as Morgan prepared a simple dinner of chili and cornbread, Jamie appeared in the kitchen doorway. I can help, he said quietly. I know how to cook. A little. Morgan nodded, stepping aside to make room at the counter. Sure. You can start by chopping those onions. They worked in companionable silence for a while, the only sounds the rhythmic chopping of the knife and the bubbling of the pot on the stove. My mom taught me. Jamie volunteered suddenly. Before she died. Morgan paused, wooden spoon in hand. It was the first personal information the boy had offered. Your mother, my niece, she was a good woman, Morgan said carefully. I should have known her better. Jamie's knife stilled. Why didn't you? Morgan stirred the chili, buying time. Families are complicated, Jamie. Sometimes people get stuck in their ways. It's one of my biggest regrets. Jamie resumed chopping, his movements precise and careful. Is that why you took me in? Regret? Morgan considered the question. Partly, he admitted, but also because sometimes life gives you a second chance to do the right thing. And only a fool turns that down. Outside, the wind picked up again, whistling around the corners of the old ranch house, like a restless spirit. But inside, for the first time, the silence between them felt almost comfortable. The Clearwater Elementary and Middle School was a long, low building of faded red brick that served all the town's children from kindergarten through 8th grade. Morgan had arranged for Jamie to start the following Monday, giving him the weekend to settle in. "You need school supplies," Morgan had realized belatedly on Sunday evening. "Notebooks and such." Jamie had shrugged. "I've got a pencil." So Monday morning found them at Jensen's again, hurriedly filling a basket with the items on the school list the principal had faxed over. "Uncle Morgan," Jamie said, testing the word carefully as they stood in the checkout line. It was the first time he'd called Morgan anything other than sir. "Yeah, what if?" Jamie trailed off, then tried again. "What if it happens again?" Morgan didn't need to ask what it was. The pattern was clear from the social worker's files. Strange occurrences, frightened foster families, hasty removals. "Then we'll deal with it," Morgan said simply. "Together." Jamie's eyes widened slightly, as if this was a response he hadn't anticipated. Principal Matthews was waiting for them when they arrived at the school, a thin woman with a perpetual look of mild concern. "Mr. Blackwood, Jamie," she greeted them, extending a hand. "Welcome to Clearwater Middle. I've assigned Jamie to Ms. Reeves' 6th grade class." As they walked the hallways toward the classroom, Morgan noticed the stares following them. Teachers paused in their conversations, and students whispered behind cupped hands. News traveled fast in small towns. "Ms. Reeves," Principal Matthews said as they entered a classroom decorated with student artwork and science posters. "This is Jamie Walsh, our new student." The teacher, a young woman with curly hair and kind eyes, smiled warmly. "Welcome, Jamie. We've got a desk ready for you right here." Morgan squeezed Jamie's shoulder awkwardly. "I'll pick you up at 3. Jamie nodded, his face a careful mask that revealed nothing of the anxiety Morgan knew must be churning beneath. Back at the ranch, Morgan threw himself into work, trying not to watch the clock. He repaired fence line damaged in the storm, checked on the pregnant heifers due to calve in the spring, and began the paperwork for the insurance claim on the lost cattle. At 2:30, his phone rang. "Mr. Blackwood?" Principal Matthews' voice was tight with strain. "There's been an incident. We need you to come to the school immediately." Morgan's heart sank as he drove the familiar road into town, his mind racing with possibilities. Had Jamie lashed out at someone? Run away? Or was it something stranger? Something that would feed the whispers already circulating? He found Jamie sitting alone in the principal's office, a split lip dripping blood onto his shirt collar. Principal Matthews and Ms. Reeves stood nearby, along with a red-faced man Morgan recognized as Bill Thornton, who owned the hardware store, and a boy around Jamie's age with a rapidly blackening eye. "What happened?" Morgan demanded. "Your nephew attacked my son. That's what happened," Thornton snapped. "Unprovoked." Jamie's head shot up. "That's not true. Quiet, all of you," Principal Matthews interrupted. "Ms. Reeves witnessed part of the altercation. Let's hear from her." The young teacher stepped forward. "I was on playground duty. I saw Tyler and some other boys surrounding Jamie by the fence. There appeared to be some pushing. By the time I reached them, both boys were throwing punches." "What were they saying to you?" Morgan asked Jamie directly. Jamie stared at the floor. "Nothing. Tell me," Morgan insisted. Jamie's jaw tightened. "They said I was a freak. That I killed my mother. That animals die when I'm around." His voice dropped to a whisper. "That I'm the devil's child." Morgan felt a cold fury rise in him. He turned to Thornton. "Your boy said that to him?" Thornton had the grace to look uncomfortable. "Kids repeat things they hear. Doesn't justify violence, doesn't it?" Morgan stepped closer to the man. "You want to say those things to me instead? See how I respond." "Mr. Blackwood," Principal Matthews interjected hastily. "This isn't helping." Morgan took a deep breath, forcing himself to step back. "What happens now?" "School policy requires a 1-day suspension for fighting. For both boys," she added, with a pointed look at Thornton. "They can return on Wednesday." Morgan nodded curtly. Fine. Let's go, Jamie. They were halfway to the truck when the first snowflake fell. By the time they reached the parking lot, fat white flakes were swirling around them, despite the clear sky forecast for the day. It follows me, Jamie said quietly as they got into the truck. The cold. The storms. It always has. Morgan started the engine, watching as the snowflakes grew thicker, obscuring the windshield before the wipers could clear them away. It's Montana in December, he said finally. It snows. But as they drove home through the sudden squall, Morgan couldn't help but wonder what else might follow the boy who sat silently beside him, watching the snow with eyes far too old for his 12 years. 3 weeks passed in an uneasy rhythm. Morgan and Jamie settled into a routine of quiet breakfasts, school drop-offs, ranch chores, and simple dinners, during which they gradually learned to exist in each other's space. The boy was still guarded, but occasionally Morgan caught glimpses of who Jamie might be beneath the layers of caution, a dry sense of humor, a meticulous attention to detail, a gentleness with animals that belied his reputation. School remained a challenge. Jamie kept to himself, eating lunch alone and avoiding the other children during recess. His teachers reported that he was bright but withdrawn, completing his work without enthusiasm or complaint. The weather, meanwhile, had been unusually severe, for snowstorms had hit the region since Jamie's arrival, each seemingly centered over the Blackwood Ranch. The meteorologists on the Billings news station called it a persistent localized weather anomaly, but the residents of Clearwater had their own theories. That's his truck, Morgan overheard Mrs. Peterson say to her friend as he and Jamie entered the post office. Morgan Blackwood, the one who took in that boy. Brave man, her friend replied, not bothering to lower her voice. After what happened to the Miller family when they fostered him. Morgan felt Jamie stiffen beside him. What's she talking about? He asked the boy later, as they drove home. Jamie stared out the window. The Millers were my fourth foster family. They had a horse farm outside of Bozeman. Morgan waited, knowing there was more. There was a blizzard. Mr. Miller went out to check on a mare that was foaling. He got lost between the house and the barn. Jamie's voice was flat, emotionless. They found him the next morning, frozen, just 50 yards from his front door. Morgan gripped the steering wheel tighter. That wasn't your fault. They said it was. Mrs. Miller said I brought the storm with me. Jamie's voice caught. That I wanted him to die because he yelled at me for breaking a dish. Morgan pulled the truck to the side of the road and turned to face his nephew. Listen to me, Jamie. Weather is weather. It's not controlled by people, especially not by children. What happened to Mr. Miller was a tragedy, but it was not your fault. Jamie met his eyes for the first time in days. How can you be sure? Morgan didn't have an answer that would satisfy either of them. That night, Morgan called Clara at the hospice facility, where she'd been moved the previous week. Her voice was weaker than before, the cancer stealing more of her strength each day. How is he? She asked after they'd exchanged pleasantries. Holding his own, Morgan replied. Clara, I need to ask you something. These stories about Jamie, about the weather. There was a long silence on the line. Has it been happening there too? Morgan thought about the frozen cattle, the unexpected storms, the whispers in town. Maybe. I don't know. Clara's sigh was barely audible. It started after Ellie died. The cold seems to follow him, especially when he's upset or afraid. She paused. The doctors called it a coincidence. The therapist said it was magical thinking, that Jamie blamed himself for his mother's death, and the weather patterns were a way for his mind to make sense of his guilt. And what do you think? I think my grandson is special, different, but not in the way people say. Her voice strengthened with conviction. He's not dangerous, Morgan. He's just a child carrying too much pain. After they hung up, Morgan sat on the porch for a long time, watching the stars and thinking. The night was clear for once, the cold clean and bracing rather than malevolent. A sound from the barn caught his attention. Grabbing a flashlight, Morgan made his way across the yard. Inside, he found Jamie sitting in the straw beside a pregnant heifer that had been showing signs of distress earlier that day. She was making noises, Jamie explained, not looking up. I thought she might be lonely. Morgan knelt beside them, checking the animal. Her breathing had steadied, and the wild look in her eye had calmed. You have a way with them, he observed. Jamie shrugged. I like animals. They don't judge. Jamie, Morgan said carefully, I talked to your grandmother tonight. The boy's hand stilled on the heifer's flank. She told me about what happened after your mom died. About the cold. Jamie's shoulders hunched as if anticipating a blow. Are you going to send me away now? No, Morgan said firmly. But I think we need to talk about it. If there's any truth to what people say. There isn't, Jamie interrupted, his voice rising. I don't make the storms come. I can't freeze things. I'm not. His voice broke. I'm not what they say I am. The heifer lowed softly, disturbed by the tension. Outside, the wind began to pick up, whistling around the corners of the barn. Okay, Morgan said gently. Okay, but something's happening, Jamie. And whether it's connected to you or not, we need to figure it out. Together. Jamie looked up, his face vulnerable in the dim light. You really won't send me away? No, Morgan promised. You're family, and family sticks together. As they walked back to the house, the wind died down as suddenly as it had risen, leaving the night still and peaceful once more. January gave way to February, and still the storms came, circling the Blackwood Ranch like predators stalking prey. School was canceled more often than not, leaving Jamie and Morgan to pass the long days in each other's company. They fell into a pattern of shared chores, quiet meals, and evenings spent by the fire, while Morgan taught Jamie to play chess or read aloud from the Louis L'Amour novels that had been his own childhood escape. The isolation should have been oppressive, but Morgan found himself appreciating the forced proximity. Without the distractions of town or school, Jamie gradually lowered his guard. Morgan learned that the boy had his mother's quick mind and his grandmother's stubborn streak. He was observant, noticing things about the ranch and its workings that sometimes surprised even Morgan. What they didn't discuss was the weather. By unspoken agreement, they treated each new storm as ordinary, even as the snow piled higher around the ranch house, while reports came in of clear skies just 10 miles away. Then came the call they'd both been dreading. Clara had taken a turn for the worse. The hospice nurse thought it might be a matter of days. We need to go to her, Morgan told Jamie, who sat at the kitchen table, his face pale but composed. Pack a bag. Enough for a few days. The drive to Billings was tense, the roads treacherous, with black ice, despite the clear skies. Jamie stared out the window, his breath fogging the glass. She's the only one who ever believed me, he said suddenly. Morgan glanced over. About what? That I didn't want it to happen. The cold. The storms. Jamie traced a pattern in the condensation on the window. She said my mom was the same way. Morgan's hands tightened on the steering wheel. What do you mean? Grandma said Mom could make the air warm when she was happy. Flowers would bloom early in our yard. Birds would nest in our trees before anywhere else. A ghost of a smile crossed Jamie's face. She called us her weather workers. Morgan thought back to his niece, Ellie. He hadn't seen her since she was a teenager, but he remembered a sunny, laughing girl who seemed to carry summer with her even in the depths of winter. Your grandmother never mentioned this to me, he said carefully. Jamie shrugged. She said people wouldn't understand, that they'd be afraid. Like they were afraid of Jamie now, Morgan thought. The hospice facility was warm and quiet, the smell of antiseptic barely masking the underlying scent of sickness and approaching death. Clara lay in a narrow bed, her once robust frame now so thin that she barely made a bump under the blankets. There's my boys, she whispered as they entered, her smile transforming her gaunt face into something of the sister Morgan remembered. Jamie rushed to her side, taking her hand carefully, as if afraid she might break. Morgan stood awkwardly at the foot of the bed, suddenly aware of all the years they'd wasted in stubborn silence. I'm sorry, he said, the words inadequate but necessary. Clara's eyes, still sharp despite her failing body, met his. No time for that now, big brother. Just promise me you'll take care of him. I will, Morgan said and meant it. They stayed until visiting hours ended, Jamie telling Clara about the ranch and his tentative friendship with Rusty, carefully avoiding any mention of storms or frozen cattle or school troubles. In the motel that night, Morgan woke to the sound of soft crying. Jamie sat by the window, his small frame silhouetted against the parking lot lights. "She's going to die," the boy said when he realized Morgan was awake. "Just like Mom." Morgan got up and sat beside him. "Yes, she is. I'm sorry, Jamie." "Everyone leaves," Jamie whispered, "or sends me away." "I won't," Morgan promised again. Outside, snow began to fall, gently at first, then with increasing intensity, blanketing the motel parking lot and the surrounding streets. Jamie noticed it too. "See," he said bitterly, "it's happening again. Because I'm sad. Because I'm scared." Morgan watched the snowfall for a long moment. Then he made a decision. "Come on," he said, standing up. "Get dressed." "Where are we going?" "Outside." 5 minutes later, they stood in the empty parking lot as snow swirled around them. Jamie huddled in his coat, looking miserable and afraid. "Close your eyes," Morgan instructed. Jamie looked skeptical but obeyed. "Now, tell me what you feel." "Cold," Jamie muttered. "No," Morgan said patiently. "Not the temperature. What do you feel inside?" Jamie was silent for a long moment. "Sad, scared, angry." "Good. Now, I want you to think about something that makes you happy. A good memory." Jamie's brow furrowed in concentration. "Mom and I used to make cookies on snow days. She'd let me lick the spoon." "Hold on to that feeling," Morgan urged. "Remember how it felt to be safe and loved." For several minutes, they stood in silence, the snow continuing to fall around them. Then, almost imperceptibly, the quality of the air changed. The snowflakes became lighter, more sporadic. "Open your eyes, Jamie." The boy looked up in wonder as the snowfall gradually tapered off, the clouds parting to reveal a star-studded sky. "Did I do that?" he whispered. "I don't know," Morgan answered honestly. "But if you did, it means you can control it. And if you can control it, you don't have to fear it." Jamie reached out, catching a final snowflake on his palm where it melted instantly. "How did you know?" Morgan thought about his sister's words. "He's not dangerous. He's just a child carrying too much pain." "Because I'm starting to understand you," he said simply. "And I think you're starting to understand yourself." Clara died peacefully 3 days later, with Morgan and Jamie at her bedside. Outside the hospice window, the sky remained clear and calm, a brilliant blue that seemed to go on forever. As they drove back to the ranch the following day, Jamie asked, "What happens now?" Morgan considered the question carefully. "Now we learn. Together. Whatever this thing is, whether it's real or just something between your ears, we figure it out. And if people in town still think I'm different, then they'll just have to get used to it," Morgan said firmly. "Because you're not going anywhere." As they crested the hill that overlooked the Blackwood Ranch, the winter sun broke through the clouds, casting long shadows across the snow-covered fields. For the first time since Jamie's arrival, the air held a hint of approaching spring. "Home," Morgan said, nodding toward the ranch house in the distance. Beside him, Jamie smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes. "Home," he repeated, as if testing the word. And in that moment, something thawed between them that had nothing to do with the weather.